Here's this description of baptism for the dead, also carefully researched. Every week, at special ceremonies in Mormon temples, the congregations meet and are given a certain quota of names of the departed to pray into their church. So there you have it. That's how it's done. Okay, now into some more serious things, because he only spends a few pages on the Mormons, but he does devote a considerable amount of time to the Bible. And I'll just pick up a few points. I'm telling you, this book is a treasure trove of good stuff. I remember the Far Side cartoon. You may have seen this, of the one deer looking at the other deer, and the deer has a target on its back, and the other deer looks at him and says, "Gee, bummer of a birthmark." Or, alternatively, I think of someone walking around with a "kick me" sign hanging on his rear end, and I am one who's not disposed to not kick. So here are just a few things out of many, many things that could be picked up. I mean, I'm picking from an embarrassment of riches here. All religions, he says, have staunchly resisted any attempt to translate their sacred texts into languages understood of the people. Now, what are the facts? According to the United Bible Societies, the Bible has been translated into 2,167 languages, with another 320 in process. And this is by no means merely a modern phenomenon. The Bible was the most widely translated book in the ancient world. It was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, in the 2nd century BC, Aramaic by the 1st century BC, Old Latin by the 2nd century AD, the Syriac, Peshitta, in the 3rd century AD, Coptic, Egyptian, 4th century AD, Old German, or Gothic, in the 4th century AD. Jerome's Latin Vulgate, that's been talked about here, was done in the late 4th century. Armenian, early 5th century. Ethiopic, 5th century. Georgian, 5th century. Old Nubian by the 8th century. Old Slavonic by the 9th. Christian Arabic and Saadia Gaon's Jewish Arabic version by the 10th. Get the idea here? There's been a lot of translation effort that's gone into this. The history of the translation of the Buddhist scriptures is precisely the same. So this statement that he's making draws on one thing. He's trying to universalize a very isolated phenomenon connected with a specific religious controversy, and that is the one regarding the translation of Scripture during the Protestant Reformation. But even in this limited context, his argument is based on unsubstantiated assertion. There would have been no Protestant Reformation, he assures us, if it were not for the long struggle to have the Bible rendered into the Vulgate. Now think about this one. Aside from the obvious fact that the term Vulgate refers not to translations of the Bible into the vernacular, but to a particular late 4th century translation by Jerome, already referred to, translating the Bible into German as an issue of the Reformation never appears among Luther's original 95 Theses. It wasn't a major issue of the Reformation. In fact, the Bible had been translated into German in the 14th century, and a German Bible had been printed by Gutenberg in 1466, 13 years after his publication of the Latin Bible. By the time Luther had nailed his theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church on the 31st of October in 1517, the act that's generally regarded as the beginning, the opening salvo in the Protestant Reformation, Gutenberg's German Bible was nearly 65 years old. So how serious an issue could this have been for Luther? He made his own, and his own Bible is tremendously important for German culture, but it was not a major issue in the Reformation and the polemics. Now, turning specifically to the English Bible, various parts of the Bible had been likewise translated into Anglo-Saxon from the 7th century on, with interlinear Latin Anglo-Saxon versions by the 10th century. The Venerable Bede, one of the greatest figures in ecclesiastical history in Britain, who died in AD 735, is said to have translated the Gospel of John into Anglo-Saxon. The problem during most of the medieval period was not that the church was attempting to suppress the translation of the Bible. This may come as a shock to some Latter-day Saints who've heard this story. But that all literate persons in the early Middle Ages knew Latin. There was no particular point in having another translation. The other people couldn't read. Hitchens laments, and I love this one, that devout men like Wycliffe, Carverdale, and Tyndale were burned alive for even attempting early translations of the Bible into vernacular literature. This is another example of the care with which he approaches his research. Far from being burned at the stake, John Wycliffe died while hearing Catholic Mass in his parish church. Miles Coverdale died unburned in 1568 at the age of 81. Of the 3 translators mentioned by Hitchens, only William Tyndale, ironically also known as Hitchens, was burned at the stake. Here's an example of biblical interpretation as he does it, the Akedah, the near sacrifice of Abraham's son. Hitchens' polemics fail completely to put this into context. In his discussion of the Akedah, or Abraham's binding or near sacrifice of his son Isaac, Hitchens describes it as mad and gloomy, a frightful and vile delusion. He says there is no softening the plain meaning of this frightful story that God would require humans to sacrifice their children. But this is not the message the ancient audience would have gotten from that story. The message they would have gotten is, God does not require the sacrifice of their children. Instead, he allows a substitutionary sacrifice instead of human sacrifice. There are other biblical problems that he points to. According to Hitchens, quote, the Old Testament is riddled with dreams and with astrology, the sun standing still so that Joshua can complete his massacre at a site that has never been located. Well, first of all, the sun standing still has nothing to do with astrology, which developed centuries later. The other thing is that Gibeon, the site where the battle occurred, can be located in any biblical atlas. It's an easily found site. Okay, on the New Testament. For Hitchens, the New Testament exceeds the evil of the Old. That's astonishing to me, really. It shows how extreme his case is. Most people will point to the evils of the Old Testament God, but they kind of feel comfortable, even if they're agnostics, with the New Testament God. But for him, Christianity is even worse than the ancient Hebrew religion. And it's very difficult to imagine the New Testament being worse because he has boundless scorn for the Old Testament. Hitchens' basic argument is, quote, the case for biblical consistency or authenticity or inspiration has been in tatters for some time, and thus no revelation can be derived from that quarter. Like the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament is for Hitchens merely a crude forgery. So any evangelical anti-Mormons who take pleasure in his description of the Book of Mormon as a crude forgery will have the smiles erased from their faces pretty soon when he gets to the Bible. He feels the same way about that. It was hammered together long after its purported events. The notion that the Gospels could be based on eyewitness accounts is a patently fraudulent claim. It's an error to assume that the four Gospels were in any sense a historical record. Now, there happens to be, on the question of eyewitness testimony in the New Testament, a fascinating new book by Richard Bauckham called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony, which argues meticulously, I think, that you can argue, or the case is that the New Testament Gospels are in fact based on eyewitness accounts, that they have access to eyewitness testimony. Whether they were written by the eyewitnesses or simply on the basis of eyewitness testimony is a matter of irrelevance to him. The fact is they go back apparently to very specific eyewitness testimony, and he is very careful in laying this out. Of course, Hitchens pays no attention to these sorts of things. His research, as I say, is limited largely to Google and a handful of endnotes. The most outrageous assertions are made, and you look in the back for any justification for them, nothing. He'll go 20, 30 pages without any kind of documentation whatsoever. This is one that I like. Hitchens, it's probably not coincidental that Hitchens provides no scholarly sources for his claim that the Gospels as we have them were based on oral accounts. Why doesn't he provide any documentation for that? Because the consensus of even secular biblical scholars is precisely the opposite of his claim. Matthew and Luke use at least two written sources, Mark and Q, according to the consensus. And that's, the Q is an abbreviation for the German Quelle, of course, which means source. It's essentially defined as passages found in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, all right? Now, Hitchens is aware of this hypothetical source Q. Remember, he's talking about consensus accounts. But he understands it in a hopelessly garbled fashion. He describes it as the book on which all four Gospels may possibly have been based. He says it's known speculatively to scholars as Q. Now note first that Hitchens is aware that Q is a written source, a book, which is a direct contradiction of his claim that the Gospels are based on oral sources. Then notice, well, he simply can't have it both ways. But he's further mistaken. He claims that all four Gospels were based on Q, all four of them. Now, in reality, only two are thought, even by the consensus he refers to have used Q, Matthew and Luke. John has nothing to do with Q. John is not one of the synoptic Gospels. And Q is defined precisely as the material common to Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark. So where does he get off saying that Q is the source for all four Gospels? There's no one who holds that, let alone a consensus. He's also mistaken in his claim that all of Jesus' disciples were illiterate. Presumably he's making this claim in order to lessen their value as witnesses. Presumably illiterate people are stupid and can't recognize what they see or record it or remember it accurately or dictate it to anyone accurately. In fact, there's no evidence for their illiteracy, and in fact considerable evidence against it. There are lots of cases of them writing letters, of Jesus reading, for example. That the early Christian movement was dominated by illiterates is simply unsupported in the sources.